Yes, a very good afternoon and thank you for keeping it NTV Uganda. My name is Romeo Busiku. Now on June 10th, 2019, the International Labour Conference, while observing 100 years of the International Labour Organization, actually adopted Convention 190 and Recommendation 206, instruments that would guide member states to actually enact some measures or policies that would eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work. We are not talking about the workplace only, but the whole world of work. Elimination of violence and harassment in that regard. Will it work? We have C190, an instrument that hasn't been in the works for almost so many decades. But then we saw in 2019 a game changer. But what does that mean for all the workers in the world? I'm now joined by the Director of Labor from the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, Mr. Martin Wandera. And I also do have in studio Miss Juliet Kutiabwana. She's the Youth Representative, RUF Women Project Uganda. And they both join me right now in studio. A very good evening, Wandera and Juliet. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, viewers.
Now, let me start with you, Mr. Wandera. What is Convention 190 and Recommendation 206?
Let me preface the explanation of what Convention 190 and Recommendation 200 is with some
206.
206 with some brief observations. First, as you know, for many people, work is their source of a livelihood. But has also been observed that in the course of work, many workers suffer a lot of human rights violations in the form of violence and harassment at work. The ILO estimates that about 813 million women aged 15 years and above have suffered some form of violence and harassment in the world of work. And let me hasten to add that this is not only a problem of developing countries. Statistics from OSHA, USA, that is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, shows that every year about 2 million workers suffer violence and harassment, resulting into injury of about 458,000 and about 500 deaths every year. Now, despite it being recognized that violence and harassment was a serious human rights violation, until the 21st of June 2019, there was no international legal instrument that addressed violence and harassment at work, that defined what violence and harassment in the world of work was, that sought to eliminate it, nor gave ILO states parties guidance on how to eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work. So that's what makes Convention 190 on ending violence and harassment in the world of work and Recommendation 206 groundbreaking instruments. Now, one may want to know what is Convention 190?
Indeed.
Now, Convention 190 on ending violence and harassment in the world of work, like any other convention or international treaty, is an international legal instrument that sets basic rights and principles for protection of workers in the world of work. The specific rights that Convention 196 to secure for workers is the protection against violence and harassment in the world of work. The Convention defines violence and harassment in the world of work as a range of behaviors, practices, threats thereof, whether a single occurrence, repeated, that aims at, results in, or is likely to result in psychological, physical, and economic harm against any worker, including gender-based violence. And gender-based violence, for those who might be interested in knowing, refers to violence that is targeted as an individual or group of individuals because of their gender, or the violence or harassment disproportionately affects such an individual or group of individuals. Now, one novelty about Convention C-190, which is a great departure from other ILO conventions, is that it expands the scope of protection both in terms of space, but also in terms of individuals who are protected. All ILO conventions, save Convention 190, only protect people workers who are in an employment relation. Similarly, our Employment Act, if you look at Section 3, protects only people who are in an employer-employee relationship. However, in the case of Convention C-190, it protects everyone within the world of work. For example, Convention C-190 protects interns who, under the Employment Act of Uganda, for example, are not protected because they are usually not in an employment relationship. It protects trainees and apprentices. It protects clients, patients, and many other categories of people who hitherto were not protected. You know that medical workers often come under a lot of harassment when people are distressed and they have fear of losing their lovely ones. Sometimes they fail to control themselves and attack health workers. I do not have statistics about Uganda, but in the US, statistics show that 47% of all physicians have been physically harassed by patients. But you also know that medical workers harass patients, especially female patients. Now, with this convention, patients and health workers will be protected from any form of violence, but they will also be liable for criminal prosecution if a health worker or a patient perpetuates violence against one another. Now, the other thing that is novel about this convention is that it expands the space within which workers' rights with respect to violence are protected. You need not harass someone at the workplace alone, say at NTV, for you to come under the ambit of this convention. The convention, when ratified, will be applicable in any situation which is related to work, is linked to work, or arises out of work, and includes even travel. If I traveled with Juliet, she's my staff, we went to Nairobi, and I physically assaulted her, or in any other way, I cannot plead that that was not our workplace. The convention would be applicable.
So it doesn't matter where it happens, as long as it happens?
As long as it happens. And the governments and the employers will have a duty to enact legislation to ensure that workers are protected at the workplace, within employer accommodation if it is provided, during travel, or even when they are commuting. For example, one phenomena that has resuscitated or re-emerged during COVID has been employer-organized transport. Now, under this convention, if you harass someone on the bus, transporting you to or from work, one would be liable for prosecution. But also the employer has a duty to make sure that the transport that is organized is safe for workers and that nobody will harass an employee while they are on employer-organized transport.
Let me also bring in Julie Kutiabwana. She is the youth representative working with IUF Women Project in Uganda. Now, Juliet, help us break down the different forms of harassment and violence in the world of work. It's really important. And then after that, help us understand. We also know that women are disproportionately affected more when it comes to domestic violence in the world of work, not simply just the workplace. So help us break down the different forms of violence and harassment in the world of work, and also help us understand why Convention 190 is going to be a game changer for vulnerable groups.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening once again, viewers. To break down the different forms of violence and harassment, violence takes different forms, definitely, because this can be physical,
Indeed.
It can be emotional, it can be economical, depending on the affected party. As long as this kind of violence affects the victim physically, emotionally, economically, in such a manner.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, if the victim is harassed, we're hopeful that if this convention is ratified, it will save the women workers who are disproportionately affected by domestic violence. Like Mr. Wandera has said, statistics show that women are disproportionately affected by domestic violence.
How so?
Pardon?
How so?
Research has shown that. Even statistics has shown that.
Help us give us examples.
For example, in the recent COVID-19 situation, domestic violence is on the increase, it's on the rise, and it's evident that women are affected mostly. So with the ratification of Convention 190, we are hopeful that this will help to protect the women workers in the world of work, because the convention gives a holistic approach to this. When you go to Article 4, Section 2 of the convention, it tasks the member state that has ratified the convention to have a gender-responsive approach to domestic violence. Yeah.
And of course, while I was doing research about this whole Convention 190, all the women activists were actually so happy. They were saying this is a game changer for us. Imagine a man following a woman to the workplace and then, you know, assaulting the woman from her place of work. So they were saying that C190 might offer some kind of help because it would protect the women in the workplace. But then we also understand that women are also not grappling with people who are outsiders, but also in the workplace itself, they might find danger. Help us understand that.
Yeah, the women were happy because, like I've said, the convention offers an integrated, inclusive, and gender-responsive approach. If the women are affected at the workplace or outside the workplace, as long as they are on duty, this convention, first of all, when the convention is ratified, it is domesticated into law. So that means if this convention is ratified, it will be included in the Ugandan law. So the women will be protected because they'll be having a defense for their rights. It's a violation of human rights, by the way, to assault someone or to violate someone. Yeah.
Mr. Wandera, let's talk about the new elements that have been entailed in Convention C-190 and Recommendation 206, the new elements.
Yeah, first, but before we do that, let me just pick it up from where Juliet ended. The convention takes a comprehensive approach to protecting vulnerable people, especially women, from violence. For example, the GBV that is taking place, has been witnessed during COVID, has mainly taken place at home. But violence at home affects performance at work. And many times, the bosses who are men like me are insensitive. Because if a woman suffers violence at home, physically, or she's beaten, and she's unable to turn up for work, then many employers will say that is not my business.
True.
Because that is the violence arising out of your relationship, and it has got nothing to do with my work. What this convention calls upon member states, workers and employers organizations, is to make sure, as Juliet has said, there is a comprehensive response. If violence is taking place at home and it is affecting someone's work, the employer should pick interest and, where possible, provide social support, psychosocial support to a victim of this kind of violence. Now, the other thing that is important about this convention, as Julie has said, is that it's going to change the landscape of our employment law. And as government, we have already initiated the process of ratifying Convention C-190. As a first step, we have submitted the convention to the Solicitor General's office for legal review to ensure that nothing within the convention conflicts with our constitution, and for that matter, there would be no problem in ratifying such a convention. But if it's found necessary, then in certain instances, a convention like this can cause the amendment of the constitution so that its application at municipal level or country level is not affected. So for those who are very eager, especially the women rights organizations, would like to assure you that the ball has been set in motion towards the ratification of this convention. As soon as we get the Solicitor General's opinion on this matter, we'll initiate stakeholder consultation and ultimately go to Cabinet to seek approval for its ratification.
Yes, help us highlight some of the new elements in Convention 190.
Now, one of the new elements, as I told you, is expanding this. First, it defines what violence and harassment is, which I did. Until 21st of June 2019, that was not there. Two, it expands the scope of coverage. As I said, all the other ILO conventions apply to people who are in an employment relationship and while they are at work. This convention expands the scope of coverage of labor law beyond the workplace. As I said, if I harass someone, if we are on a trip abroad or anywhere, inland, under the current law, it would be under the currently it would not come under the responsibility of the employer. Because one would say that happened outside the workplace and it's none of my business. But now employers will be responsible for ensuring that their workers are protected at the workplace, but even off the workplace, as long as they are engaged in anything that arises out of their work or is linked to their work. The other thing is that the law recognizes, the convention recognizes different media that can be used for harassment. It could be verbally, if I talk to you right now, if I use ICT-enabled communication, if I send someone, if I shout at someone, all those medium of communicating or sending out violence and harassment are recognized by the convention.
Juliet, why are Convention C-190 and Recommendation 206 important to reach equality in the world of work?
Recommendation Convention C-190 and Recommendation 206 is very important to reach out to equality, because still in the articles of the convention, that is Article 7, it is clearly stated that the member state is mandated to ensure that there is no discrimination of any kind in line with gender, faith, and all that. So the convention itself is comprehensive, and it will help us to fight gender discrimination and inequality at workplaces. Yeah.
What about mainstreaming gender in policies that guide workplaces?
All that will be catered for as long as the convention is ratified, because it has all those elements clearly stated in the convention. In the articles, Article 7 puts it clearly that once the member state ratifies the convention, it has to include that in the law to ensure that there's gender mainstreaming at workplaces, and in the policies of the member state that has ratified the convention.
Juliet, does that mean that the women right now who are the most vulnerable are sitting ducks now that Uganda hasn't ratified Convention 190? Does that mean that the women are sitting ducks right now and there is no law to protect them?
Not really. I think there's some laws that the Director of Labour will guide us on that, because definitely the domestic violence is being practiced right now, and women are seeking help from security organs around. But if the convention is ratified, it will reinforce the protection of rights of women against domestic violence, especially in the world of work. At least they'll have an instrument, a tool to protect them that they will refer to in case they are affected. Yes, because the convention itself encourages the member state that has ratified to put out information to the masses, to the public, so that they can access it and be able to fight for their rights. That is why this convention is very important, because it encourages that empowerment in regard to information and knowledge.
Mr. Wandera, even before the ratification of Convention 190, can the instruments be used by the different trade unions that are grappling in their places of work? Can it be used by the vulnerable women in its form before ratification?
Now, before ratification, the convention does not have binding effect in Uganda. However, it has persuasive influence because it articulates the high standards to which all human rights respecting people should aspire. Of course, some jurists will argue that if you support the adoption of a convention as Uganda did, then under a principle of Pact Sunt Servanda, then you are bound by it. But technically, under our constitution, you cannot claim a right based on this convention. Now, Juliet spoke about laws that exist in the country on non-discrimination. But our Employment Act, for example, only talks about sexual harassment. That's section 6. However, it is not as detailed on issues of violence and harassment as the convention is.
So the definition of violence and harassment in our constitution or laws isn't the same as C190.
It is limited.
All right.
So that's something which is new. But also you asked if all the countries, let's assume for argument's sake that all the countries have some form of laws, or Uganda has.
Yes.
Then why do we need the convention? You know very well that the world has become a global village. Many non-citizens or aliens come to work here. So do Ugandans work in many other countries. And since violence and harassment is a human rights issue, then there is need for an international standard upon which countries would be assessed. It would not be very good if in Uganda I'm protected against violence and harassment, but then when I go to work in country X or country G, I suffer violence and harassment.
True.
The other thing that is why international instruments are important is that when ratified, they subject countries that have ratified to international scrutiny. For example, for all the conventions that Uganda has ratified, we periodically report to the ILO the measures that we have taken to achieve the rights that are recognized in those conventions. And therefore, as and when Uganda ratifies Convention 190, then periodically we would have to report that this is what we have done to bring our laws in tandem with the convention. But you also asked something about women being disproportionately affected. That is true. Statistics show that 74% of the perpetrators of violence and harassment in the world of work are men. That is statistics from the UN Women. So this convention, therefore, will be a game changer for women if we domesticate it through our legislation. It will afford women protection that they have not had hitherto. For example, right now, if there is a supplier who came to a workplace and they harassed an employee, the employer would have no role. Or if it is vice versa.
All right.
My employees harassed a supplier, I would have to make sure that I take action within the provisions of this convention.
All right, Mr. Wandera Martin, he is the Director of Labor at the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. And also in studio, I do have Kutiabwana Juliet. She is the Youth Representative, IUF Women Project, Uganda. You're still watching NTV. Let's take a very short break. We'll be right back with more on this conversation that is focusing on ending domestic violence and any form of violence in the world of work. We'll be right back. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us right here on NTV. We are talking about how best we can end domestic violence or any other form of violence in the world of work. Like I hinted before, I do have the Director of Labor in the Gender Ministry, that is Mr. Martin Wandera. And I also do have Juliet Kutiabwana. She is the Youth Representative, IUF Women Project, Uganda. Mr. Wandera, we are back and let's talk about the trade unions. So why is it so important to ratify? Why is it so? Why is Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 important to our trade unions, especially here in Uganda?
Now, you know, trade unions are established to protect the rights and interests of their members.
Right.
And you can only make a claim for a right that is encoded in law. And the array of rights that C190 introduces, and when we ratify, will provide a legal basis for workers to demand for non-discrimination, for a non-violent workplace. And they will also use the provisions of the Constitution during, of the Convention, I beg your pardon, during their collective bargaining sessions. So in addition to our Constitution, the different laws, this Convention will provide another basis for them to make demands or claims during collective bargaining. But it will also be a basis, I guess, for them to demand that government ratifies or amends our laws to reflect what is in the convention. But as I said earlier, the government and the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, to be very specific, has no problem in ratifying this convention.
Right.
Because as you might know, Uganda was the chief spokesperson for the Africa Group in the negotiation of this convention. And we are therefore doing everything to make sure that its provisions are actualized. But as I said earlier, there is a process for ratification, and the first step is to subject it to legal review by the Office of the Solicitor General. As soon as we get his advice, we'll initiate stakeholder consultation and go to Cabinet with the hope that we'll get the okay so that the Minister of Foreign Affairs does ratify.
Juliet, now 2 countries have already ratified Convention 190. We have Uruguay and Zambia. They've already ratified these instruments. So now, what is stopping Uganda in that case? I would throw that to you, Mr. Wandera. But then let's go with Ms. Julie. Now, 2 countries, Zambia and Uruguay, ratified C190, and they can use it in its form in that case. And according to the research I did, it will take 12 more months after the ratification with these 2 countries for this law to come into force. And I was also hearing that trade unionists and other vulnerable people can use it in its current form, even though Uganda has not ratified the Convention C190. What do you make of that?
Yeah, trade unions can use this convention, though before it is ratified, it is not binding enough. However, they can take clauses from the convention and they negotiate them into their collective bargaining agreements with the employers so that they can protect the workers in that manner. But before the convention is ratified, it will be just an issue of negotiation. If the employer takes it, then that is it. If the employer drops it, then the employer will not be bound by the convention. However, we hope that when the union negotiators keep using this convention, it will enlighten the employers to see the advantage of the convention and the clauses in the convention so that they can also be part as stakeholders in the campaign for the ratification of the convention.
Maybe just to add to what she has said, she forgot to say that the trade unions, not to be specific, have through their workers' representative, Agnes Kunihira, sponsored a private members' bill seeking to amend the Employment Act. And some of the provisions have been lifted from Convention C 190. for example, the phenomena of the world of work versus a workplace. The entire provisions on protecting workers while they are on duty, when they travel for duty, when they are in employer accommodation, and many others have been picked. So I can see the unions are already using this convention, and if Parliament passes that bill and the President's assents to it, it will become part of our law even before Cabinet approves the ratification. So there are many other creative ways, as Honorable Kunihira has been, through which you can actualize the provisions of this convention. So it is already serving a purpose. Yes.
So in the absence of C-190, what is the Gender Ministry doing to protect workers from harassment and violence in the world of work?
Of course, the Employment Act protects workers against sexual harassment and requires workplaces with 25 employees and more, which we are going to have a workplace policy on sexual harassment. But the law defines harassment in restricted terms. It is only restricted to sexual harassment. However, the scope of definition within Convention 190 goes beyond sexual harassment to include physical harassment like bullying. If I'm the boss, as I am sometimes, and I'm just shouting at my team, I don't listen. If I have a small disagreement with any of my staff and I deny them responsibility, I refuse to delegate. I don't give you work. You come to work and you do not have work. All those are forms of bullying. Now, the current Employment Act does not take into account some of those forms of violence and harassment. And therefore, I'm happy that the Convention 190 expands the frontier of violence and harassment. And we believe that it will go a long way in serving the efforts for ending violence and harassment in the world of work. Now, many a time when we talk about violence and harassment in the world of work, and which is always the case, it's the employer who is the perpetuator.
But it could also be the other way around.
Yes, many employers are subjects of violence and harassment. And the way labor law has been drafted historically, it has assumed that the employee is the less powerful or the vulnerable, and it always seeks to protect workers, which is a correct principle. But when it comes to issues of violence and harassment, we have seen employers being victims of violence. For example, if there is a strike and it goes violent, we've seen employers locked up in their offices, denied access to food, medicine, and water. Now, the Employment Act right now did not cover that. So did the Labor Unions Act. Now, with Convention C-190, whether the perpetrator of the violence is an employee or an employer, they will have to be regulated by law. So, which for me is another novelty and positive one at that.
Juliet, what immediate ramifications would come out of government refusing or actually taking long to ratify Convention 190?
As you know that now with the presence of COVID-19 and the fact that we are going into the new normal, we really need to have a gender equal new normal. But this cannot be achieved when there is still domestic violence in place. So if the government takes long to ratify the convention, surely this will not help the women as we go into the new normal, because you cannot have equality when there is discrimination, especially at the workplaces. So the delay in the ratification will delay the achievement of a gender equal new normal. Yeah.
In your opinion, Wandera, if it takes long to be ratified, what would that mean to the vulnerable groups in Uganda?
Of course, if it takes long to be ratified, then it will not have effect, but also will not be able to access technical assistance that the ILO gives for legislative reform. But I would like to hasten to say that our constitution is quite progressive, and whereas it doesn't, the constitution and its enabling legislations did not specifically protect workers from violence and harassment, there are other legislation, including the penal code, that protect people as human beings from any forms of violence and harassment. However, many of those laws are not known by actors in the world of work, and their application therefore is often limited. And that's why we are pleased that there is a convention that is specifically focusing on the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. But as I said, the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development is committed to ensuring that this convention is ratified. Because as I said, this is a baby of the ministry, because the delegation of Uganda, because of the work that the leadership in this country has done in emancipating women, was selected to be the spokesperson of all the 53 African states for 2 years in the negotiation of this convention. And maybe I'll just use this opportunity to thank my former boss, Mr. Pius Bigirimana, who was Africa's spokesperson, and our head of delegation in those 2 years, Hajat Janat Mkwaya, who was our minister then. They provided very useful leadership. They are not with us, but we are going to make sure that this progressive convention and its provisions are actualized in Uganda through the lay-down procedure, and that is through ratification. But even without ratification, the instrument can be used for purposes of awareness.
True.
Because the starting point of human rights protection is awareness.
Knowing that there is a law that can
Knowing
protect you.
that there is a right, an international right. Because you cannot claim for what you do not know.
Indeed.
You cannot start a journey without knowing where you are going. But now the Convention C-190 on ending violence and harassment in the world of work has set a standard to which all human rights respecting people will have to aspire. So we, as the motto of some school, which I don't want to mention, says Gachari Mavaga, we are going there. It is a standard set, and that's what international human rights instruments are. They set a standard to which you aspire.
Indeed.
And this is what C90 is doing.
All right, Mr. Wandera, let's use some kind of visualization. Now, supposing Uganda ratifies Convention 190, what will it take to implement the measures or guidelines entailed within the Convention 190 at the regional and national level?
First, we'll have to do a legal audit. Juxtapose the Employment Act and all other labor laws with the convention, and see where our laws are inconsistent with the convention, and therefore take legislative reforms to bring all our labor laws in tandem with the provisions of the Constitution. So that's what we'll have to do. But you know also very well that laws, however good, are not self-enforcing. One thing then that we'll have to do is create awareness in the public, because people must demand for these rights, but also to train all our labor officers in the countries on the provisions of this convention, so that when they are handling labor disputes related to matters provided for in the Constitution, they can do so from a point of knowledge. But of course, we'll also, through our awareness campaigning efforts, bring all employers' organizations at the Federation of Uganda Employer, NOTU, and COFTU, which are the two labor union federations, to speed about the provisions of this convention. Rights are protected best, as I said, if people are aware. Because from my years of experience, I've noted that many times workers' rights are violated by employers because of lack of knowledge. And when you create awareness, and also create awareness by giving a value proposition to employers, showing them if there is no violence and harassment at work, your workers will be happy, workers will be productive. I have no doubt that employers will and workers alike will embrace this convention and will be supported as and when it is ratified by Uganda.
And upon ratification, implementation, what challenges do you expect to encounter along the way while implementing these guidelines?
First, there will be the challenge of knowledge. But also, people do not adapt to change very quickly. Because, as I said at the beginning, labor law has been limited to the workplace. But now, the realm of protection of workers' rights relating to harassment and violence is being expanded beyond the workplace to include while you are commuting. If violence takes place against a worker by another worker while they are commuting, the employer is expected to take disciplinary sanctions against such a worker. So some of these novel provisions, I believe, will find some resistance, because the employer would say, the Martin and Juliet were in Nairobi. What could I have done? I don't even have any means of establishing what happened. But I believe if you're interested as an employer, you will be able to investigate, and where there is no evidence, then there will be no action to take. But employers will be expected to have policies, in-house policies on violence and harassment.
What would happen if they don't respond?
They will be in breach of the law. Because if we ratify, change our laws, then it will become part and parcel of the laws of Uganda. And you know what happens when the law is breached. The long arm, as they say, will reach out, and sanctions, as provided in the law, would take effect.
Juliet, what kind of help will you need, or support will you need from the government upon ratification of C-190 when it comes to implementation of the guidelines? What kind of support will IUF need?
The major support that we will need as advocates for this ratification would be effective implementation, because ratification itself is not enough if implementation is not done appropriately. So upon ratification, we would request the government to implement all the details and the requirements of the convention to ensure that there is no tolerance or zero tolerance to domestic violence against workers in the world of work.
And are you absolutely sure that C-190 will eliminate violence and harassment in its form if we actually ratify C-190?
Yes.
You're absolutely sure?
Mm-hmm. We are sure that C-190 can change lives because following the requirements of the convention, if implemented well, workers will be, first of all, they will be empowered with the knowledge, so they will know how to defend their rights and claim for their rights. And if the implementation is effectively done, then the perpetuators of domestic violence will be put to they will be held responsible for their actions, and at least it will reverse the situation, we are sure.
Ms. Awandera, let's talk about recommendations in the next 5 minutes moving forward.
Now, yes, as I said at the beginning, conventions are legal instruments that are binding to countries that ratify them and have a duty to domesticate them into their own laws. Now, whereas recommendations are also international instruments, but they are non-binding. They provide guidance on implementation of the convention. For example, in our jurisdiction, you have acts of parliament, which will state general principles. But the actual guidelines on implementation are in what are called regulations or statutory instruments. So, for example, if you want to develop a policy, a workplace policy on ending violence and harassment, those details are not in the convention.
I see.
But the recommendation 206 gives you guidance on how to draft
and implement C-190.
Yes. If, for example, the convention says that a country that ratifies should enact laws for ensuring that workplaces are free of violence and harassment.
Right.
But then recommendation 206 gives the details
how you can go about
how you can do that, what you should cover. So recommendations, ILO recommendations, are generally guiding principles to ensure effective application of the conventions which are binding.
And do you expect to carry out a countrywide campaign as the Minister of Gender, Labour and Social Development to actually create public awareness about the existence of such and such a very, very good law like Convention 190?
That is part of our work, creating awareness, because you can only achieve application of a law if there is public engagement and participation.
Right.
Because a law is obeyed by citizens. Citizens, employers or workers alike can only obey a law that they are aware of. And that is it will be our duty as soon as we ratify to create awareness about the provision of this convention. But even before ratification, it is our duty, as we are doing right now, to explain the provisions of the convention, and when it is ratified, we'll continue with the awareness, but also enforce compliance of the laws.
All right. Okay, this next question is going to cut across to Ms. Awandera and also to Juliet. Of course, we know that Zambia and Uruguay have ratified Convention 190, but then we want to know what is stopping other countries from ratifying Convention 190 if it is so good? I mean, it's so good. It was adopted in June of 2019, but up to now, yes, up to now, a year later, we are still talking about only 2 countries, Mr. Awandera. What could be the problem?
No, you know, there are different countries have different procedures
1 minute
for ratification. And ours starts with the legal review. We submitted to the Solicitor General. I believe if it wasn't for COVID, we would have already gotten back feedback. We have been told we would get feedback in about 14 days, and when that happens, we'll initiate stakeholder consultation, go to Cabinet, and I have no doubt that Cabinet will...
But why is there no consensus from these other countries?
No, it's not. I will not speak for other countries. I will speak for Uganda. We have initiated the process
All right, all right,
for
all right, all right.
ratification.
Okay, that is well understood. Juliet?
Yeah, I will not differ much from what Mr. Wandera has
Yeah.
said. Like he has said, there are processes to
Indeed.
follow, and each country has its own processes, but still, there is also the magnitude of advocacy.
True.
Some of the governments need a lot of advocacy and pressure to ensure that some of these conventions are ratified and not shelved. So we should intensify advocacy, but also following procedure. But just to inform you,
Right.
there are so many other countries that are taking on the process. For example, if you look at the newsletter that was published by ITUC, there are so many countries, Zimbabwe, South Africa, they are coming on board. Only that the process is not yet completed, as Mr. Wandera has said. But
Indeed, and
soon
I
or
also
later, many
yeah.
countries will ratify the convention.
Indeed, and I also had so many women activists from South Africa, Zimbabwe saying this is the time to have Convention 190. Imagine 5,000 delegates all over in June of 2019. 40 heads of state, and only we have 2 countries actually ratifying C-190. It's appalling. But then you're watching NTV. My name is Romeo Busiku. The conversation has been largely centered around ending violence, yes, violence in the world of work and in any of its forms. My name is Romeo Busiku. We've come to the end of this conversation. Please, all governments in Africa ratify Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. Have yourselves a blessed day.